He was America's sheriff, the man who made an entire nation believe in a small town called Mayberry, where problems were solved with patience and a kind word. For more than 50 years, Andy Griffith was as familiar as a member of your own family. So when he died on the morning of July 3rd, 2012, the world expected a grand farewell, a funeral worthy a legend. Instead, by lunchtime that same day, before most of America even knew he was gone, Andy Griffith was already in the ground, buried on his own property in under 5 hours. No public funeral, no procession, no goodbye, and for years, people whispered that something was wrong. The truth is stranger and far more deliberate than any conspiracy. The morning everything happened too fast. On the evening of July 2nd, 2012, Andy Griffith fell gravely ill at his home on Roanoke Island, on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. He was 86 years old, and he made a choice that tells you something about the man. He refused to go to the hospital. Instead, he gathered his closest friends and family around him and said his goodbyes. His wife of nearly 30 years, Cindy, was at his side. There was no frantic ambulance ride, no team of doctors fighting to keep him alive in a sterile hospital room. He chose to spend his final hours in his own home, on the island he loved, with the people he cared about most. And in the early hours of the next morning, July 3rd, at around 7 a.m., Andy Griffith died. The cause was a heart attack, complicated by underlying health issues, including hypertension and coronary artery disease that had troubled him for years. What happened next is the part that stunned the country. By 11:30 that same morning, just 4.5 hours after he took his last breath, Andy Griffith's body was lowered into a grave on his own property. No public viewing, no days of lying in state, no funeral that fans or even distant friends could attend. There was no embalming, no elaborate preparation, no waiting period of any kind. A funeral home representative confirmed the timeline to the press, lowered into the ground by 11:30 in the morning, on the same day he died. For most people, the news of Andy Griffith's death and the news of his burial arrived at almost the exact same moment. By the time America learned that its beloved sheriff was gone, he was already buried. The speed of it was so far outside the normal order of things that people immediately began to ask the obvious question. What was the rush? What were they hiding? The answer would not come from a press release. It would come years later, from the pages of biography and the testimony of the people who were actually there. The whisper conspiracy. When a beloved public figure is buried before most of the world even knows they have died, people talk. And in the case of Andy Griffith, the theories started almost immediately. Some wondered if there was something suspicious about the cause of death itself. Why no autopsy? Why no public examination? Others pointed to the fact that he was buried on private property, in a location the family refused to disclose, and asked what could possibly require that level of secrecy. A few even questioned the role of his third wife, Cindy, who was the sole person at his bedside and who handled the arrangements. The executive director of the state's Funeral Directors Association, a man named Larry Stiegel who had been in the business for 32 years, admitted that he had never seen anything like it. He said he could not recall ever having heard of a burial happening so fast. He explained that the normal practice would have been to wait several days, giving extended family and friends time to travel, to view the body, to mourn together in the traditional way. None of that happened for Andy Griffith. That admission, from a veteran funeral director who had handled countless deaths, poured fuel on the speculation. If a man with 3 decades experience had never seen a burial this rush, then surely something unusual was going on. It is worth pausing here to clear up one thing, because it matters. What Andy Griffith did was completely legal. In North Carolina, home burial on private property is permitted. The state does not require embalming. It does not require a vault or a commercial casket. As long as a death certificate is properly completed and the local requirements are met, a family can bury a loved one on their own land. So nothing about the burial broke any law. The speed was unusual, even shocking, but it was entirely within Andy Griffith's rights as a private landowner in North Carolina. And here's the truth. Something unusual was going on, but it was not a crime. It was not a cover-up. It was a plan that Andy Griffith himself had put in place long before he died, for a reason that says everything about the kind of life he had lived and the kind of death he wanted. To understand it, you have to understand what Andy Griffith was afraid of, the thing he feared more than death. Andy Griffith spent more than half a century as one of the most recognizable men in America, and with that level of fame came a price that he came to despise: the cameras, the crowds, the relentless intrusion of a public that felt it owned a piece of him. He had watched what happened when famous people died. He had seen the circus, the helicopters hovering over private homes, the photographers climbing fences and trees to get a single shot of a casket, the crowds of strangers turning a family's most private grief into a public spectacle. He had seen funerals become media events, with news crews broadcasting live and tabloids paying for forbidden photographs. And Andy Griffith decided, while he was still alive and in full control of his faculties, that none of that would happen to him. According to biography written by Daniel DeVice, who had unique access to the Griffith family, Andy had already determined exactly what he did not want. He did not want helicopters over his home. He did not want press coverage of his death. He did not want swarming crowds trying to catch a glimpse of his casket. So he asked a small group of trusted friends to do something specific: to bury him immediately after his death, before the paparazzi could storm Roanoke Island and capture his remains on film. That is the real reason. Not a conspiracy. Not a cover-up. A man who had given the public 50 years of himself, and who wanted the one thing that fame had always denied him: privacy. A quiet, dignified exit on his own terms, in the ground of the island he loved, before the outside world could turn it into a show. But carrying out that plan required more than just a willing family. It required the help of an entire community. And what they did to protect him is one of the most remarkable parts of this whole story: the sheriff who grounded the helicopters. Here is a detail that most tellings of the story leave out entirely, and it is the part that makes the whole thing feel like something out of one of Andy Griffith's own scripts. When Andy died and the plan went into motion, the people of Dare County, North Carolina, closed ranks around him. These were his neighbors, the local people of Roanoke Island, where he had lived for years, who knew him not as a television star, but as a man who lived among them. And they understood exactly what he wanted. According to DeVice's account, the local sheriff took an extraordinary step. He grounded helicopters in the area to keep camera crews away from the Griffith estate. Think about the poetry of that for a moment. Andy Griffith, the man who played the most famous fictional sheriff in American history, was protected in death by a real sheriff who uses authority to keep the cameras at bay. The fictional lawman of Mayberry, shielded by an actual lawman doing exactly what Sheriff Andy Taylor would have done, protecting one of his own. The community did its part. The helicopters stayed on the ground. The camera crews never got their shot. And Andy Griffith was laid to rest in peace, exactly as he had asked. But that hectic, compressed timetable came at a genuine cost, and it fell hardest on the people who loved him most, because the same speed that kept the paparazzi away also kept his own family from saying goodbye. The daughter who could not say goodbye. The most heartbreaking consequence of Andy Griffith's rush burial is one that almost no video about this story mentions. His only surviving child was not there. Andy Griffith had 2 children from his first marriage, both adopted. His son, Andy Samuel Griffith Jr., known as Sam, had struggled with addiction for much of his life and died in 1996 at the age of 36. The loss devastated his father. Sam had battled alcoholism and the demons that came with growing up as the son of one of the most famous men in America, and his early death was a wound that Andy carried for the rest of his life, that left his daughter, Dixie Griffith, as his only surviving child. And when her father was buried just 4.5 hours after his death, Dixie could not get there in time. The timetable was simply too fast. By the time the news could even reach everyone who needed to know, the burial was already happening or already done. His lone surviving child could not attend her own father's burial. Years later, Dixie spoke about it. She did not express anger. She understood why it had happened. She confirmed the very reason behind it, saying that her father did not want a funeral. He did not want a circus, and he did not want a media frenzy. She understood his wishes completely, but she also expressed her regret at not being able to be there, at not being able to stand at his graveside, and say goodbye to the man who had raised her. There is a particular kind of grief in understanding completely why you were left out of something, and still wishing with all your heart that you had been included. It is a quietly devastating detail. In his determination to avoid a public spectacle, Andy Griffith created a private burial so swift and so close that even his own daughter was left out of it. The plan worked perfectly. The cameras never came. But the cost was that some of the people who loved him most never got their moment of farewell. T.